I just want to thank the Institute for Jewish Spirituality and Society, and of course, Phil Wexler, old friend of mine, and of course, the Rebbe, well, without which none of this would be here today. So because I work a lot in social science and religion, I decided to talk today particularly on psychoanalysis. And my guiding question is a simple one. What do the various models of the mind found in the history of the psychoanalytic tradition, and by that I mean from Freud up through ego psychologists and the object relation theorists, what do they have to offer to advance the aim of the heightened awareness and existential actualization of interdependence? Initially, the issue is about personal transformation, but there is an addendum to this, which is the corresponding need for social structural change. That dimension of psychoanalysis has been there from the start, as is illustrated in the now familiar distinction between Freud's clinical works and his applied cultural ones. I'll come back to that later. Turning first then to personal transformation, it has been well established that Freud falsified his metapsychology throughout the course of his career. As he was faced with new clinical data, his theory shifted and adapted. Most are familiar with his last theory of the mind, the famous structural model, composed of the aggressive and sexual drives of the id in conflict with the defensive mechanisms of the ego and the moral injunctions of the superego. Ego psychology, inaugurated after Freud's death by his daughter Anna and a host of others like Heinz Hartmann, Ernst Kriss, and most famously Erik Erikson, took up and furthered his formulations on what can be called the mechanistic ego, and additionally his depiction of the unconscious, best seen in Erikson's positing of an instinct for care and generativity, and views of the life cycle development. Object relations extended Freud's view on the ego, or sense of I, born of relationships as it matured through the course of the narcissistic line of development, a clinically neutral and not morally pejorative concept. Social scientists and culture theorists add to this by noting that Freud's data set was fueled by an emerging industrial society where Oedipus, obsessional neurosis, and hysteria were exacerbated by the then extant economic and familial organizations, as well as by social constructions of gender. Oedipus, it turns out, may be a universal possibility, but contra Freud and his totem and taboo, not necessarily a universal actuality. Similarly, that same group of theorists will point out that, put colloquially, ego psychology is what you get when you take classical psychoanalysis out of Vienna and ship it on a boat to New York City with this capitalistic valorization of an executive ego. Again, object relations theorizing is bound to happen when, in the aftermath of World War II, one finds many families without fathers, mothers that must work, and latchkey children, the latter being all too bereft of parental monitoring and mirroring. There is then a fit between culture, clinical data sets, and the necessary falsification of theory. To be sure, the advances of theory build on its previous iterations to show both continuity and difference. So along these lines, I've written about what I call the emergence of transformational theory in psychoanalysis, which speaks to a new body of work that seeks to legitimize a spiritual dimension to the human personality. As with social scientists and culture theorists, I see such theoretical advances based in a social soil populating by the growing numbers of those best characterized as approximating that ideal type Weber called the inner worldly mystic. And like ego psychology and object relations theory, one can provide continuity with the psychoanalytic past through a retrospective mining of its previous formulations. Given time constraints, I can only seize on but a few such formulations in building a brief narrative, one that has the fault of mapping out an all too general direction while omitting, as with any narrative in a postmodern world, alternatives culled from the same sources, alternatives that many may well prefer. In a general sense, I will argue for the psychoanalytic trend that equates personal transformation with an increase in the capacity for empathy. In itself, that is hardly anything new. What may strike some as being new is the way that I will go about it. With those caveats, then, I will begin by focusing on an amendation to the unconscious that Freud offered, but that has been roundly ignored, mainly because that amendation proceeds from his belief in thought transference or telepathy. Freud penned not one or two, but 6 essays on thought transference and telepathy. And in the end, not only became converted to its reality, but also made it known that psychoanalysis has paved the way for what he took to be its inevitable scientific verification. It is then unfortunate that this episode of psychoanalytic theory and history, in taking a cue from biblical studies, which is appropriate given that there's a concordance to Freud's substantial oeuvre, has been relegated to the status of being apocryphal. Indeed, the term apocrypha, which literally means things hidden away, and which designates texts of uncertain authenticity, those which fall outside the canon, or writings where the authorship is questioned, is an apt characterization of the treatment accorded to such texts by a majority of those within the psychoanalytic community today. Even strong defenders of Freud, like Ernst Jones, were taken back by Freud's conversion. Jones' consternation was certainly brought to a boil when, in confronting Freud about the matter, was met with an intensely mischievous reply, the content of which intimated that thought transference was a step on the slippery slope to acknowledging the existence of, as Freud put it in quotes, der liebe Gott, the loving God. In theorizing about the manifestation of telepathy, Freud insisted on 2 general conditions. First, telepathy was facilitated when 2 people were emotionally tied, the paradigmatic example being parent and child. In other words, a certain empathy was cast as conducive for the transmission of telepathic knowledge. Next, he recognized that receptivity to telepathic messages was enabled by having one's attention diverted from the objects of ordinary, everyday rational consciousness, or by being in certain altered states, for example, sleep and the dream life. Finally, in asking his readers to, quote, have kindlier thoughts on the objective possibility of thought transference and at the same time of telepathy, end quote, Freud offered a working theory to explain such phenomena, and I quote, the telepathic process is supposed to consist in a mental act in one person instigating the same mental act in another person. The analogy with other transformations, such as occur in speaking and hearing by telephone, would then be unmistakable. It would seem to me that psychoanalysis, by inserting the unconscious between what is physical and what was previously called psychical, has paved the way for the assumption of such processes as telepathy. One has led to a suspicion that this is the original, archaic method of communication between individuals, and that in the course of phylogenetic evolution, it has been replaced by the better method of giving information with the help of signals, which are picked up by the sense organs. But the older method might have persisted in the background and still be able to put itself into effect under certain conditions. It is a kind of cyclical counterpart to wireless telegraphy. Remember Freud's writing in the early part of the 20th century. Freud's reference to a, quote, original archaic method of communication, end quote, which can become operative under specific conditions like altered states, recalls an analysis he had made in Civilization and Discontents of how mystical practices, as well as trances and ecstasies, could unearth the primordial depths of the unconscious. As important, those following Freud cited his texts on telepathy to make their claim to the interdependence found in moments of telepathic merging. For example, the object relations theorist Heinz Kohut stated that among the altered states found in the analytic, the clinical analytic session, was that of a deep form of empathy which resulted in thought transference. When he said this, he cited Freud's papers on telepathy. For Kohut, empathy is innate, but increasingly overlaid by other non-empathic modes of knowing during the course of development. In deliberately citing the exact Freudian text surveyed above that I just quoted, Kohut claimed that psychoanalytic practices, physiologically speaking, required both a certain level of somatic, physical relaxation, and with respect to mentation, the, quote, intentional curbing of the usual cognitive processes, end quote. These are the conditions that allowed for the manifestation of empathic modes of communication in the clinical encounter that could rightly be termed telepathic. In one such episode, Kohut, after having treated a man with obsessional neurosis, found himself performing obsessional acts, such as repeatedly checking to see if his office door was locked. So here it is not a question of the sympathy. This kind of deep empathy which is required of a good analyst, means an alteration of one's own psychological structures that at one and the same time helps the other, the capital O, heal, yet takes that other's suffering upon oneself, as is demonstrated in Coet becoming obsessional neurotic. In other words, we have come across a psychoanalytic form of what's known in theological circles as vicarious suffering. Erik Erikson's star student, the Indian psychoanalyst Sudhir Kakar, follows suit by coining the notion of what he called an amplified empathy, which is a psychoanalytic version of the epistemological form so familiar to philosophers and theologians, namely knowledge by direct acquaintance. And to those familiar with science fiction, Robert Heinlein's concept of grokking. I think that shows my age. Bringing psychoanalysis into dialogue with Hinduism, specifically the Upanishads, Kakar contrasts Freud's structural model, Erikson's distinction between the Freudian mechanistic ego and the preconscious I, and the concept of personhood found in the Upanishads. Kakar asks what, psychologically speaking, the term moksha, which is the Hindu term for becoming free from all reincarnation and liberated, what moksha could mean. For Freud, the mechanistic ego does not designate the personality, but an agency that mediates between the unconscious, the superego, and reality through various defensive maneuvers. The Ericksonian self, different from the Freudian ego, is preconscious, can be made conscious, and designates one's social roles and personality. The I, on the other hand, is more problematic, for it is neither the ego or the self, but that which reflects on both. For Hindus, this I is pure consciousness. The Atman, whose counterplayer is Brahman. In Kakar's rendition of Upanishadic thought, moksha, and here I'm quoting him, quote, can be understood to mean that a person living in this state has an all-pervasive current of I. I is the center of awareness and existence in all experienced situations and in all possible selves. Moksha, however, is not limited to gaining awareness of I in a composite self, that's to say, a singular individual. Rather, it is held that this ultimate meaning is not realized until a person also has a similar feeling of I in the selves of others, an empathy amplified to the point of complete identification, end quote. Importantly, in valorizing the buried, archaic modes of knowing we have already seen in Freud and Coet, Kakar goes on to state, again I quote, in the Hindu ideal, reality is not primarily mediated through the conscious and preconscious perceptions, unconscious defenses, and rational thought processes that make up the ego. Rather, it emanates from the deepest and phylogenetically much older structural layer of personality. Remember Freud's primordial depths. The id, the mental representation of the organism's instinctual drives. Reality, according to Hindu belief, can be apprehended or known only through those archaic, unconscious, pre-verbal processes of sensing and feeling, like intuition, or what is known as extrasensory perception. It is the aim of Hindu mystical practice to empower one to access such modes of knowing. Okay, so these various formulations, from Freud to Coet to Kakar, are held together by not only knowledge of the other as facilitated by a deep form of empathy, but the moral injunction to put aside the self in favor of the needs of the other. In amplified empathy and grokking alike, there is no I. Rather, there's a meeting with the other which quite naturally and without self-consciousness asks one to perform acts of healing and vicarious suffering in light of a higher good, namely the movement towards the whole, now seen as inexorably interrelated. To be sure, the fact is that we are interrelated, hence this primordial dimension of consciousness. Anything else means that one is living a psychological illusion. Moreover, this is not a one-shot deal. One of the primary aims of a successful therapy is precisely the cultivation of an internal soil, which quite naturally and spontaneously engages in such acts of deep empathy as a matter of course. That would signify the maturation of the person. As an aside, and although I'm not going to undertake that here, what I've just said is something akin to the psychoanalytic contribution to the more philosophically framed Levinasian encounter with the other. Okay, so I'm going to turn now to social structural matters. I'm done with the personal transformation for the moment. So the portable lesson here lies in the German title of Freud's great cultural work, Civilization is Discontents, namely Das Unbehagen in der Kultur. What Freud really meant by Unbehagen only becomes clear as Freud's argument unfolds. Humans are dissatisfied and uneasy in civilization for the same reasons we have already seen. Our innate aggressive instinct makes us asocial. But Freud adds a corollary to this. Our dissatisfaction is increased by what he calls the, quote, unpsychological proceedings of society, end quote, particularly its commands in institutions, which is to say, the content of the cultural superego. In other words, psychoanalysis is not only that therapeutic intervention that contributes to lessening the unease, the Unbehagen in individuals through active therapy, but also through the applied analysis of cultural pathology, the unease, the Unbehagen created by unpsychological social institutions. Now, at its face value, religion now framed as supplying a major part of the content of the cultural superego. Freud often referred to religion as being the cultural superego. We'd like to think that it valorizes the existential actualization of interdependence. And so in Freud's nomenclature, it would contribute to the advancement of eros. However, the historical fact is that it is often done the opposite, fomenting hatred, wars, and tribalism. Applied psychoanalysis can help by revealing, here I'll put it in quotes again, the developmental infrastructure which mars the otherwise noble aims of the commands, ideals, and doctrines promoted by the cultural superego. To take an analogy, if the divine is depicted by the stars one sees at night, and Earth's atmosphere, the distortions of that light, manufactured by developmental and social structural determinisms, then psychoanalysis would be that tool that can help decipher the nature of those determinants and hopefully deconstruct them. The classic example of this, which goes along with what I've been saying here, is Freud's analysis of the Christian love command. Ostensibly, it's supposed to be loving your neighbor and creating interdependence. So initially, one might take it to be in the service of eros, being one of the mental assets of civilization designed to counter aggressive antisocial instincts. However, in its unqualified and extreme form, which insists that one love universally, Freud thought it to be unpsychological and difficult, if not impossible, to fulfill. For it's based on the assumption that our ego has unlimited mastery over the id. If more is demanded, like to love universally, then one is capable of producing, then there will be psychological consequences. As Freud put it, revolt will be produced in him, or neurosis, or he will be made unhappy. He went on to attribute the origin of this extreme framing of the love command to developmental factors, specifically that issuing from the pre-Oedipal phase of development. The command to love universally compels because it caters to the nostalgic pull of, and in fact is the developmental residue of, a time when love was abundant and one did not distinguish between objects. One is enjoined to love everyone as oneself because it recalls an ideal time when in fact that was the case. But the matter becomes much more important when Freud links his analysis of what I just said about the love command to what he calls the, quote, narcissism of minor differences, end quote. A developmentally challenged version of the love command, that is to say one that is disturbed by the Earth's atmospherics, fails to take into account the displaced aggression which its command invariably occasions. It is always possible, says Freud, to bind a certain number of people into a group through love, but this can also lead to a form of tribalism in which the other groups of people, namely the outgroup, are left over to receive the various expressions of their aggressiveness. So you get love command, but it's only good for your tribe, and then what happens to your innate aggressivity? Well, it's foisted towards the other. That's the problem, according to Freud. And in making this analysis, Freud rightly notes that, and here I'm quoting him again, the Jewish people, scattered everywhere, have rendered the most useful services to the civilizations of the countries that have been their hosts. That's Freud at his wry, humorous best. I mean, it's not very funny, but that's what you get with Freud. Along those lines, Freud continued, it is hardly an accident that the dream of a Germanic world dominion called for anti-Semitism as its complement. So he's really referring to a structural part of human beings, this tendency. It's dangerous, and we have to be alert to that and then deconstruct it. So the psychological dynamic of what he called the narcissism of minor differences, this tribalism, this hatred, is portable. And it applies to everything from the ongoing strife between Catholics and Protestants, notably in Great Britain and Ireland in the later part of the 20th century, for those of you who remember that, and the Sunni and the Shia, right, in Iran and Saudi Arabia today, to early 21st century anti-immigration sentiment, which is filled with this. Significantly, one could extend this portable lesson to apply to cousin theological doctrines, most dramatically that of predestination and the various formulations concerning the end time. While not all religious dominations valorize the doctrine of predestination, the notion of a Protestant work ethic is quite familiar, having become part of our Western cultural superego. The idea of a holy transcendent Father beyond the reach of human supplication that forces one through hard work to create the illusion of being chosen is but one interpretation, just but one, of Scripture. Obviously, this is favored. Freud would explain his popularity as reflecting the general tenor of the relationship between fathers and sons in Calvin's era, now available writ large in a religious doctrine about the nature of God and his relationship to the believer. For many, predestination is attractive not only because it caters to the framing of a distant father God who needs to be constantly pleased, but also in turning sociological because it's a theological rationalization of tribalism, of being chosen, hence catering to narcissistic needs for love, marrying, and acceptance. Again, it's the same thing, but now we have it at a big, ideological level with predestination. So this doctrine of predestination is susceptible to forms of tribal violence, of which the doctrine of apocalyptic divine judgment, the end times, is an extreme form. What is pathological in Freud's view is that such doctrines are nothing more than imaginative creations, rationalized fantasies, as it were, of developmental themes, needs, and conflicts. The frightful next step is when they are co-opted by religion and used to justify social actions, an analysis worth considering given their contemporary status as doctrinal mainstays, and here I'm referring to predestination in the end times, in religious traditions as seemingly opposite of those of radical terrorists like ISIS and certain Christian members of American political parties. Hello, Ms. Bachman. Both tribes of which continue to impact contemporary world politics. The danger is that we fail to see how we collectively create and sustain such doctrines through developmentally determined imaginative activity, rationalizing and ontologizing them through religious institutions and the cultural superego, then using them as justifications to enact violence. In warning of the primitivity of the human species, psychoanalysis signifies the ways in which institutional religion can be complicit in helping developmental factors, pathological narcissism, Oedipal distress, win out over reason and the survival of the species, which is to say, religion is now in the service of Thanatos. So I'm going to end here. Time prohibits more examples, but at least I hope I've said enough to indicate the ways, and there are many more, in which psychoanalysis can be useful to help along the aim of the existential actualization of interdependence on both the personal and social structural levels. Thank you for your patience and for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Parsons, for that incredibly insightful talk. I think we're all excited to talk more about it a little bit later in the conversation. For now, I want to bring up Professor Peter McLaren. I'll say a few words about his background. Peter McLaren is Distinguished Professor in Critical Studies at Donna Ford Atala College of Educational Studies at Chapman University. He's co-director and international ambassador for global ethics and social justice at the Paulo Freire Democratic Project, College of Educational Studies at Chapman once again. And he's professor emeritus at the University of California, Los Angeles, where he taught for 20 years. He's the author and editor of approximately 50 books and hundreds of journal publications. Professor McLaren, thanks for being here with us. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, well, I'm going to spend the next 20, 25 minutes celebrating the work of Brazilian educator Paulo Freire. This year, 2021, is the 100th anniversary of Paulo Freire's birth. Of course, he died May the 2nd, 1997, but celebrations are occurring all over the world. And seminars, of course, and webinars are everywhere in many different countries around the world, this year in particular. Jair Bolsonaro, a retired army captain, who's president of Brazil, of course, has been persecuting Freire, he and his administration. This fascist president has sworn to take a, quote, flamethrower to the legacy of Paulo Freire in Brazil. And Paulo is the patron of education in Brazil, and Bolsonaro wants to have him replaced by a Jesuit saint. Now, so Paulo's legacy is undergoing what we could call, I guess, a second persecution. You know, Freire was jailed, put in prison for 70 days in you know, during, you know, the 60s when there was a fascist coup. And here we are again with the fascist president persecuting him again. Attacks on Freire are very, very similar to the attacks on critical race theory that we have been witnessing here in the United States. And we can talk a little bit about that perhaps later on. I feel the term tikkun olam captures the spirit of Freire's work. Now, I know very little about the mystical writings of the Lurianic Kabbalah, but I have read that historically it's referred to a specific cosmological account where Adam was exercised to restore God's divine light that had been shattered and dispersed during the act of creation. Acts of repair were meant to imply religious acts, but I'm using the concept with reference to Freire in a more contemporary sense. And in my use, it can be seen as synonymous with the popular concept of social justice and God as the idea of unconditional justice. By repair, I'm referring to creating conditions of possibility for producing social relations of solace and hope to diverse, restive, and aggrieved populations who are suffering under the forces and relations of domination and oppression. That theme, of course, is one of the lodestones of Freire's work. The term also resonates with Freire's profound contributions to liberation theology. Now, during this particular juncture in the history of modern humanity, the spirit of this Brazilian educator has stood steadfast above the fray. His philosophy and politics of praxis has given the oppressed worldwide assurance, or reassurance rather, and hope. A man whose contributions to the humanization of civilization has challenged the forces of oppression, domination, and alienation throughout all sectors of society. Although Freire is no longer with us in the flesh, his spirit is suffused among all suffering and marginalized peoples, as his teachings continue to be taken up by academics and intellectuals and activists, all committed, of course, to the struggle for social justice. Although Donald Trump did not mention Freire by name, he did attack the educational left as anti-patriotic and blamed cultural Marxism for creating political correctness and the political forces that accuse white men of racism, sexism, and homophobia. Now, today's post-truth politics has been so overwhelming that even our most basic assumptions about the meaning of human life fail to comport with any reference to a commonality that individuals can be reasonably evaluated against or adjudicated against. The turbulence of navigating through the debris of post-truth politics has persuaded many Anglo-Americans to surrender to an authoritarian politics characterized by a white ethno-nationalism and to choose the vile politics of white supremacy over fostering reciprocal relations of respect, understanding, and solidarity with people of color, and an interpersonal summons to justice. This has made Freire's work all the more important. The expansion of Freire's work across the mediascape that define our collective lives has never been more urgent. Offering revolutionary praxis as a means of shifting the tectonic plates of our contemporary political landscape that is witnessing the death knell of democracy. So Freirean education is not about discovering the truth of the world through some theoretical study and then engaging in a step-by-step application of our knowledge of the world, but rather it's about engaging the material world critically in ways that enable an understanding of the world that seizes the will of the learner. Those whom Freire referred to as the oppressed see a world that they believe has already been written and view themselves as having been written out of this world. Freirean critical protagonistic knowing that occurs by recognizing or recognizing the world as an arena of struggle and seeking the means to overcome the privileging hierarchies that constitute it, well, effectively rewriting the world by being in and with the world, that is, moving outside what Paulo called the fatalism that pervades the technocratic logic of capitalist modernity, which traps so many of the oppressed as victims of history. For Freire, becoming critically conscious is the path to humanization, to our ontological vocation of becoming more fully human. It's a path that creates the conditions of possibility of becoming agents capable of making history, rather than remaining bearers of history's inevitability. This is what forms the basis of a Freirean reading of the word and the world, a reading that's co-intentional. So in this sense, the student becomes the educator and the educator becomes the student. Freire understands that protagonistic or revolutionary agents are not born, rather, they're dialectically produced by circumstances. Freire was largely concerned with developing a politics of liberation through forms of literacy, and that's probably what most of us are familiar with. He was a philosopher of praxis who was in demand mostly, at least in North America, mostly by teachers and teacher educators. Although his work, you could find, I think Pedagogy of the Oppressed is the fourth most cited work in the social sciences and third in education or something like that. I forget, but it's pretty high up. And his work, of course, influenced literacy, liberation theology. Philosophy, Marxism, you name it. You'll find references to Paulo Freire's work. But he was also interested in, for instance, regional development and agrarian reform. Cultural theorist Bell Hooks notes that one important reason that Paulo's book, Pedagogy and Process, the letters to Guinea-Bissau, had been important for her work is that it's a crucial example of how a privileged critical thinker approaches sharing knowledge and resources with those who are in need. And we know that Paulo traveled constantly after his exile. He referred to himself as a kind of a vagabond, a tramp, right, of the obvious. He was just really stating and pointing out asymmetrical relations of power and privilege, which should be relatively obvious, but aren't talked about. He traveled constantly. He was a wanderer. He traveled, there was a brief stay in Bolivia after his prison, and he went into self-exile. A 5-year stay in Chile, where he became involved with the Christian Democratic Agrarian Reform Movement. And of course, he famously worked as a UNESCO consultant with the Research and Training Institute for Agrarian Reform. There was a visiting appointment he had in 1969 to Harvard University's Center for Studies in Development and Social Change. And then he moved to Geneva, Switzerland in 1970 as a consultant to the Office of Education of the World Council of Churches, where he developed literacy programs for Tanzania and Guinea-Bissau that focused on the re-Africanization of those countries. He was involved in the development of literacy programs in post-revolutionary former Portuguese colonies such as Guinea-Bissau and Mozambique. He assisted the government of Peru and Nicaragua with their literacy campaigns. I was involved in the establishment of the Institute of Cultural Action in Geneva in 1971. And then there was a brief return to Chile after Salvador Allende was assassinated in 1973 provoking General Pinochet to declare Paulo Freire a subversive, right? And his brief visit to Brazil under a political amnesty occurred, of course, in 1979, and he finally returned to Brazil in 1980 to teach at the Pontificia University, Catholic University of Sao Paulo, and the University of Campinas in Sao Paulo. And of course, finally then in 1980, well, from 1980 to 1986, he became the supervisor of the Adult Literacy Project for the Workers' Party in Sao Paulo. And he worked briefly as Secretary of Education of Sao Paulo from 1989 to 1992, continuing his radical agenda of literacy reform for the people of Sao Paulo. I met Paulo for the first time in 1985, and he invited me to Cuba, and I think it was 1987 at a conference, and I had the privilege of getting to know Paulo somewhat over the years. And Paulo used to always say to me, look, because I was very interested in his work, and I would take his work with me on various visits to different countries. And I would tell Paulo that I was trying to share his work with the constituencies that I was involved in when I visited other countries. And he said, Peter, and he would say this not just to me, he would say this to everyone. He would say, look, please do not basically transplant my work and my ideas to other countries. If you're going to speak, and if you're speaking in China, or if you're speaking even in Peru, if you're speaking in Chile, wherever you happen to be going, remember that I think as a Brazilian, I talk like a Brazilian, I act like a Brazilian, I make love like a Brazilian. Paula was always joking, and he said, you can't really just transplant me. You have to, in some way, reinvent my work in the contextual specificity of whatever context you find yourself in, right? And so that was a very interesting observation. Freire established, I think, a new type of dialogical humanism through his lifelong engagement with the philosophy of praxis. The strategic centrality of such a praxis for Freire manifests itself in the mindful cultivation of the ontological nature of the human being as a starting point for social justice, without at the same time eclipsing or denying the importance of the spiritual self. While the central protagonist in Freire's humanism is not God, but humanity itself, more specifically what Freire calls the human-world relationship, it remains within the domain of Freire's revolutionary praxis that spiritual being and human being converge, perhaps even at times coincide, fastened together by love, by an armed love, allowing human beings to live in the fullness of history. Freire's humanism is a humanism that begins with a preferential option for the oppressed, an ethical imperative that begins with action, but then develops heuristic concepts that enable the protagonistic agent to reflect on that action in order to name the world in new ways and thus transcend the exhausted epistemics of critical pedagogy and social theory. Such reflection never takes place in isolation, but through an engagement with the other, right? Together they discover that the structure of reality is never permanent because it's never finished. They discover that those who reflect upon this reality are also part of this reality. So in some, reality is never reflected, but always refracted. We cannot know the totality of reality, but we can at least know it partially. And in doing so, we can challenge those social relations that serve the transnational capitalist class and bring about the historical concretization of the politics and praxis of liberation. So I'll conclude here. Freire incorporated the totality of his energies in an exemplary way, widening the sphere of liberation and creating paths from multiple arenas of struggle. His historical role as a key reference point in times of chaos and uncertainty has marked Freire as what I would call the archetypal man, a man for all times, a liminal symbol that can be reinterpreted and adapted to fit the times and places of struggle. He has steadied us through difficult historical periods, holding a lantern in the darkness, giving us a much needed reprieve as we tend to our wounds during defeats and as we realign, excuse me, and reconsider our strategies during victories. Spaces of possibility that are generative of his pedagogy keep the flames of hope alive. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor McLaren. I want to continue the conversation now by giving you each a chance to respond a little bit to each other's talk, and then we can continue from there into questions from the audience. But let's start with Professor Parsons. If you'd like a few minutes just to respond to Professor McLaren's talk, and we can go from there.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know much about the figure that Peter is talking, that he told us about today, although I think it's absolutely fascinating. And it seems to me that what he is doing is not unlike what I was trying to say in my talk, that we're really talking about, I mean, both the psychoanalytic tradition has historically been humanistic, right? So it's been, they bracketed the divine. What I call transformational theory is beginning to show elements of kind of what I call a generic spirituality. I don't want to go through the whole genealogy of terms like mysticism, religious mysticism, unchurched mysticism, spirituality, modern spirituality, but it's very much like a modern spirituality, the transformational. And so my point was that if you actually mine the texts, not mind it with a D, but with an E, mine the texts of previous iterations of psychoanalytic theory, you can find that. And that's what I did with Freud, with Kohut, and with Kakar. But they all point to the same thing, right? Which is that if you can use ontologically, whatever, but it's not just that we are interconnected. There seems to be, maybe it's almost like a teleology. I mean, there is a growth towards greater awareness of interdependence. And that foists on us a kind of an obligation, both to the other, whoever that means, whoever you're standing in front of. And that's what I was talking about, vicarious suffering with Kohut, taking on the suffering of the other. And it happens sort of in the no man's land between the self and the other. It's not I, it's right in that no man's land. So it's not like you're thinking, I'm doing something great. Oh, I'm helping some. No, it's not that at all. It's very much an obligation to do that. And I think what Peter's talking about is very much the same thing. Locally in Brazil, right? I don't know if Brazilian lovemaking is any different from California lovemaking, but I don't, whatever, right? So, but if so, I would like to get some help on that. So to extend that humor, but it's very much in the same category. And the more I think about what we're doing here with Jewish spirituality in the Institute, what Phil's been doing his entire career, we're all moving towards the same way. What the Rebbe was doing, in our own special way, we're trying to do this. But it's also very clear that right now we're facing serious obstructions to it, which could actually lead, because of climate change, we don't have 500 years to fix this, right? We're looking at a possible drastic alteration of the human species. So this is very, very serious is my point. And I'm an old man now, but when I look back at my students, my kids, I call them, some of my grandchildren, I think of their life in 20, 30, 40, 50 years. I'll be 6 feet under. I've had a nice life. What about them, right? So we have to be very, very clear to communicate to them the capacities for thought and the capacities for empathy and interdependence. And hopefully that generation, if they ever gain some power, will do something. I don't know if we only have 3 years left, but maybe we do. Maybe we only have 3 years left. I don't know. It's possible. So that would be basically, I'm joining hands with Peter and thanking him for his talk.
Beautiful. Professor McLaren?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for your kind words. You know, I was fascinated by your talk, and you know, I noticed that you made a reference to Levinas, and you know, and who's always been one of my favorite authors. But I think that you know, when you're looking at Freud, I remember I went to visit Freud's apartment in Vienna years ago. It was fascinating, and I remember purchasing actually a glass, a leather glasses case, you know, for spectacles. That was made exactly, you know, it was an exact duplicate of Freud's, and I gave it to somebody recently in China as a gift, and it was, yeah, I don't know, it was, for some reason I just felt a little silly with carrying this around with Freud's name emblazoned on it, but I've always been interested in the relationship between Freud and Jung, and I just wondered if you have any thoughts on that. You know, Jung was supposed to be the heir, right? Yeah. Freud's heir, and they had some interesting conversations in which, as I recall, I'm going back a few years. It's been a while since I've read this, but where there were these sounds of wood snapping or something during a conversation. I don't know if you remember that, and Jung's reaction, and Jung saw that as a kind of I guess perhaps even you know, a supernatural occurrence where Freud just brushed it off. But I think it's interesting too, because there's so much now, and I'm thinking of debates that I'm watching now on YouTube, etc., on consciousness, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that. The nature of consciousness, the brain, for instance, the consciousness doesn't reside in the brain, but it basically serves as a device of mediation, right?
Yes.
That reflects or refracts, right, a reality, a reality that exists outside of the brain. I'm just wondering if you have, I was fascinated by your talk, and I'm just wondering if you have any quick thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I could go on forever. I mean, you've touched on so many really, really important points. I'm going to go to the spiritual stuff in a second, but I thought that you personally might be interested in, you know, in some of the sort of the work on Freud that's come out of political science and also the historians. And Freud, growing up, at one point was thinking about becoming a politician. His family migrated from Czechoslovakia to Vienna, and Vienna was politically liberal, and his father thought that if Freud wanted to go into politics, that was great. And Freud at the University of Vienna in his first couple of years belonged to political parties, and he was thinking about going into politics until a guy named Karl Lueger was elected mayor of Vienna, who ran on an explicitly anti-Semitic platform with the backing of Catholic Rome. And Freud had all these dreams, and he realized he couldn't. The dream of the uncle with the yellow beard in Interpretive Dreams, a very famous dream along those lines. He had all these Rome dreams where he couldn't get to Rome, and he had to give it up. And so, but what the historians say is, you know, what he did was he then took his political aspirations and he transferred them to psychoanalysis, and psychoanalysis could be a way to transform social structure. He couldn't do it as a political figure because that road was a dead end. But psychoanalysis had this kind of subversive political, you know, aim to it, and people miss that a lot. And so I think that's very important to see that that's an aspect of Freud and Freud's cultural works, and it was located in his own personal life. He, you know, all these dreams he had, he wrote to his fiancée about all the anti-Semitism. He had dreams about his tenure case, about, you know, he knew the Jews weren't getting tenure at the University of Vienna because they were Jewish. And so all of this stuff sort of, you know, comes into the fore. Most people just look at his clinical works or whatever. That's one thing. This spiritual stuff is really, I think, fascinating as well. And so Freud and Jung and James in that sort of early period of the psychology meeting religion movement, sort of 1880 to World War II. So Freud, Jung, and James are the three figures that we know a lot about. And there are a couple of other forgotten players that, like in a movie script, they come at the very end of the, right? It's like Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie. These people are like at the very end. And scholars know about these people, but most people just know Freud, Jung, and James. There's another guy named Frederick Myers who started the British Society for Psychical Research, and he was actually very cagey. I mean, he wasn't just sort of a believer. I mean, he explored all the psychical phenomenon, and people at Oxford really respected this guy. He outed the frauds, but then there was a lot of things that he thought really did pertain to what you just said, that consciousness is not located sort of in a materialistic brain. There's the Aldous Huxley sort of brain filter theory that consciousness is the real datum, and then it uses the brain in some kind of a way. And there's a lot in contemporary psychology. I think of people like Laura Miller at Columbia, who is really well versed in this stuff and written a ton about it. And that seems to be coming to the fore. My colleague Jeff Kreipel here in the Department of Religion, he's now director of Esalen. He's totally on this bandwagon, and I'm doing some work on it as well. So Jung was much more along those lines than Freud ever was. And they clearly had a divorce, and the divorce was about religion. And Jung he was the heir apparent. Freud said to him, "I'm Moses, you're Joshua, you will take psychoanalysis to the promised land." And then Jung said, "How about a religious psychology?" And Freud said, "No, I do not want that. That's the way you have a very high voice." So, the Germans had very tight underwear, so he always spoke in this very high voice. But so they had a breakup, and then there was all this psychic phenomenon. But interestingly enough, and Freud actually fainted once when Jung pointed out this stuff. Freud just went into a dead faint. He wrote a letter to Frederick Myers of the British Psychical Society and said, "If I had to do my life over again, I would do your work." And then someone later pointed this out to him, that he'd written this letter, and Fred, "I never wrote that letter. I never wrote it." And then they adduced the letter. And so he clearly, and the whole telepathy thing is, it's not just that he was interested in it, he was basically wanting psychoanalysis to take credit for it. Wow. Well, that's been buried, right? That's been buried by, post-Freudian scholars, but not all of them. So there's this residue with this kind of spiritual Freud. In my own work, I'm trying to bring that out. And what's happened with psychoanalysis is it's becoming increasingly more like Jung. So in object relations theory in particular, Freud and Jung hated each other, but object relations theory and Jung are much more melded. And so there is this, I know I'm sort of over here, but there is this kind of real move in both in psychoanalysis and of course Jungianism. One last thing is that there's Freud and Jung, but then there's Jungianism and Freudianism, and those have taken all kinds of different avenues. And you have to be an anthropologist, sort of an ethnographer of all the different institutes around the world, because they're all different. I can tell you that from visiting them. They are different, and books need to be written about this, like anthropological investigations of, the Pacific Institute in Santa Barbara, or Saybrook or right here, the Houston, Institute, or, psychoanalysis in New York versus Chicago versus India. Sudhir Kakkar, he's basically said, we're very different in India. We have a different history. So all of that needs to be taken into account. It's very complicated. It's a great question. I don't think I did justice to it, but, for time purposes, I'll cut it there.
Thank you. That was great.
Professor McLaren, we just have a few minutes left, really just 2 minutes left. I'm wondering, given Professor Parsons has said about the relationship between Freud and religion, if you can just say one or two things maybe about the role of faith in Freire's work and how we as students of religious studies might be able to learn a little bit from Freire too, just in closing.
Well, Freire was anti-clerical, of course. Growing up, of course, with the Catholic Church, with the Concordat, with the Vatican and Nazi Germany, and just horrible things. The rat lines, the Vatican's complicity in getting Nazi war criminals to Latin America. I mean, I've done some work on this recently. So Freire obviously was anti-clerical. But he was a Catholic. He believed in God, just to put it plainly. But he was he was friends with theologians like Gustavo Gutierrez, who wrote the Theology of Liberation. It was considered that the classic work in one of the first major works in liberation theology. Gustavo asked Paulo if he would participate in contributing to the development of liberation theology, and Paulo was happy to do that and did that. But it was more like Paulo didn't have a theological take on religion. In other words, he didn't use a lot of theological terms or terminology that we find. It was mostly, his language could fit more comfortably within the social sciences. So, Paulo basically understood how the church, by trying to remain supposedly neutral, was actually helping fascist regimes, and of course, all around the world. And this is something that's really engaged me now. I've written a book, recently on evangelical Christianity and their participation in solidifying fascist ideology in places like the United States. So I've basically been writing a little bit about the circle of evangelical Christians around Trump and the horror that's wrought. And so that's something that concerns me a great deal, is the relationship between religion and fascism. And we're seeing it all around the world right now, and it's really made me nervous. Steve Bannon, the right-wing Catholics, Bannon recently said he's preparing shock troops for when Trump comes back. This is quite a frightening development. And, it's been exercising my energies for quite some time.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry to cut you off, but I think we do have to transition to the next panel. So Professor Parsons, Professor McLaren, thanks so much for joining us. I'm so sorry we have to get the other panels a chance to settle in, but I'm sure this conversation will continue. Do you want to just say maybe 2 seconds in closing?
I just had a chat, and I responded to it, but it might have been erased. And I just, whoever.
I think Jonah saw that question. Thank you so much for answering that there. I appreciate it.
I pushed the wrong button is what I was saying.
Right. I think you did everything right. No, I appreciate it. Okay, great. So I'll thank you both so much, and we'll stop the live stream there. And I encourage everyone to stick around for the next